Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Daisy and today we're going to be talking about another movie and whether or not it is historically accurate. Last time we did Titanic, this time we're doing my favourite movie of all time, and that is the 2005 adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice starring Matthew Macfadyen and Keira Knightley. Now, before people come for me in the comments, this is just about how historically accurate the 2005 version is, not the 1995 miniseries starring Colin Firth. I know a lot of people are a ride or die for that series, and if you want to see which one I prefer, which one is my favourite, then tomorrow's video I'll be making right after this video, but it'll be out tomorrow, about which one is my favourite, why I prefer it. And I know a lot of people are going to be mad at me in the comments, but it's my opinion and I have very good reasoning for my opinion. So if you want to see which one I prefer, you can check that out tomorrow. But today, we're going to be talking about how historically accurate the 2005 adaptation is. We're going to be talking about costuming. We're going to be talking about relationship and interaction between people. We're going to be talking about the social class and the hierarchy of classes in 18th century, 19th century England. Now, obviously, I'm from the UK, and in school, I learned a lot about the regency era, which is where this book is not only from, but set. And even though the director of the movie moved back the timeline from when it was originally set, which was around the beginning of the 1800s, and he moved it back to the end of the 1700s because he didn't like the height of the waist of the dresses, and he wanted to avoid that for the movie, without realising that they were still popular back then as well, but we won't get into that. Irregardless of that, we are going to be talking about, at that time, would these things have happened? At that time, would they be able to speak to each other in a certain way? We're going to get into all of that good stuff. You know, I talked about it a lot in the Titanic video, and it is also going to be the central theme of today's video, because I love talking about social class. And not only do I love talking about social class, I love talking about social class and how it affects relationships and how it affected people at the time that we're living. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. If you do like this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also check out my video tomorrow about which one I prefer. Let's get into it. So first off, we're going to start with costuming, because I feel like it's the shortest section that I can talk about. Now, obviously, the costuming in this movie had to be close to the Regency era fashion. Now, when we say that, we are talking about the updo hair, the high-waisted dress with the very, very small chest area. And apparently, according to fashion historians, according to historians in general, this movie actually had a lot of accuracies. A lot of what they were wearing were accurate, especially the cut of dress, especially the silhouette of dress, especially what the men were wearing. There were a few things that they said were inaccurate and were more accurate in the 1995 adaptation, and that was two main things. Firstly, they said the women wore white too much. Now, it is known in the Regency era that women that were available, single, unwed, would wear muted pastel colours, duck shell blue, pinks, creams. And so when there was this onslaught of like white, in-your-face, bright clothing, they said that wouldn't have been seen as much in the time, and women would have been wearing a much more muted pastel colours, still, you know, very light, still very pure, but not in-your-face white as it was shown so much in the movie, especially during the ball scenes. So they said that wasn't as particularly accurate. That was more accurate in the 1995 adaptation, because they did feature a lot more of a colour palette in terms of the muted pastels rather than the white. So they said that wasn't particularly accurate, but for everyday clothing, for what people wore in the home, for what a lot of the men wore at balls, and especially the cut and the silhouette of the dress, they said was very accurate. So the accessories that they would wear were very accurate. The pearls and the jewels in the hair was very popular. Obviously the gloves were very popular at the time. As the silhouette, the square plunge neck of the silhouette was very, very popular, and so was very accurate. So I think that overall, what are we going to give them? We're going to give them, let's give them like a 7 or an 8 out of 10 for accuracy. The 1995 adaptation was more accurate, but they got it pretty much bang on, except for some of the colour palettes in this movie. The second thing that they said definitely wouldn't have happened is when you see Darcy at the end of the movie and he has his shirt all unbuttoned and his chest is exposed, and obviously it's meant to show this you know, attraction from Elizabeth. It's meant to show this gorgeous scene of this gorgeous man walking through the fields, walking all the way from his residence to her residence to just confess his love for her because he couldn't sleep in the middle of the night. As much as that is great for the story, he wouldn't have been exposing that much skin. He definitely wouldn't have been exposing his chest like that. So that's not particularly accurate, but it's a great scene to watch. Moving on. Now moving on to the locations and the setting of this movie. It actually trumps the 1995 version in this way because the residences and the setting is a lot more accurate, you know, a lot more in the countryside. The establishments are much more varied. We have to remember this is looking at Regency era England from a purely upper class view. We've got the upper class and we have the upper middle class, I suppose they would be considered, even though they are nowhere near poor, and they are definitely a family with money, property, servants, and a vast amount of land. So let's not pretend the Bennets are poor, even though the movie does show the pig and the mud far too many times and portrays it as though they are a family that is struggling in any way. They are not. If you think the social class is rigid on the Titanic, Regency era England, it is even more so. They should be, I mean, they are closer in hierarchy to the Mr. Darcys than they would be to a normal common person, but the movie portrays them as kind of this lower class group, and they are very much not that. So I would say that although the location is correct, the house is correct, the grounds are correct, how they actually portray the inner workings of the household is not so historically accurate, because they focus a lot on how different they are to Darcy and the other upper class people, but what they're not really portraying is how much more well off they are than the regular person, you know? So even though the settings are very, very accurate, the settings for the balls, the house of residence for all of the main characters, very, very accurate, and a lot of them still stand to this day. You can go and visit them in England. I love watching this movie for many reasons, but it's also lovely to see just the English countryside. It's pretty accurate in that sense. It's pretty accurate to what it would have looked like in the Regency era. So the settings of not only the local ball, but the private ball and town where they like to visit, those are all very accurate depictions of what it would have looked like, what the people that were there would look like, and what would be going on in those particular closed settings and the public settings as well. So I really like that because it's very accurate of not only how they live everyday life, but when they do go to these occasions, when they do have these special events, what that atmosphere would have been like, what the people there would have interacted like, and what the actual rooms, buildings, and scenes would have looked like back in the late 1700s. And I really love that. Now let's talk about the most important of the historically accurate pyramid, and that is the social class. Would they have interacted? Would they have spoken? Would it have been going on? And the answer is yes, they absolutely would have actually. I mean, as I said before, Elizabeth Bennet is not a poor person, and as much as I want to talk about the book as well as the movie adaptation, I will talk a little bit about how they contradict each other. In the movie, particularly when it comes to the situation between Elizabeth's sister and Mr. Bingley, they portray it a lot about how the family interact with their level of society. And let's not forget, in the movie they do portray the Bennet family as a whole as less or poor or undeserving throughout basically the entire movie. And it's less about their actual social class and more about how they behave in these social situations, how their parents are very obviously trying to marry their daughters off into wealth and how that leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. But actually, at the time, this was a very common thing to do, and it was almost expected, especially in the upper classes, when you're trying to further your children, your family name. These kind of marriages were very, very regular and common. So when they portray it in a way in the movie that people are disgusted that Miss Bennet would ever talk about someone's money, and Mr. Bingley absolutely shouldn't marry Jane because her parents obviously just want their money, it's a little more complicated than that in real life, and it was at the time. A lot of people marry with the notion, with the understanding that it is very much not only a move for love, that was a lot less common, but also a financial move to better your family. Even though the Bennets were not poor in any way, they were not lower class in any way, her want, Mrs. Bennet's want for her family to, develop socially was very much a theme that was seen for mothers and fathers that had children, especially that had daughters in that time. And for Mr. Darcy to be so disgusted with it and Mr. Bingley to be so able to be won over from this idea didn't seem that accurate to me. In the book, it's much more about their social class and less about their greed for money, if that makes sense. The social class was very strict in Regency era England, and although they might have been invited to balls, the upper class, like Mr. Darcy, like Mr. and Mrs. Bingley, would have gone to local balls maybe. The actual integration of the social classes seemed to be the bigger problem in the books rather than this want for money, if that makes sense. There's a little bit of a distinction. I think for the most part they get that theme correct, but when we're talking about social classes, even though they are still upper class, they are still a lower class than, Mr. Darcy. So that's more of the theme where Mr. Darcy actually, develops feelings eventually for Elizabeth, and he doesn't really mind that she's not from blah, blah, blah. But 5 minutes ago, he was talking Bingley out of it purely based on their social standing, And although they do portray the parents as people who were after a development of their finances, in the movie it's a lot more of a strong portrayal of like the persistence of them finding rich partners for their wives, finding rich partners for their daughters. But actually the book kind of acknowledges that anyway, because it was a to-do thing of the time, and it wasn't so much about the understanding that their daughters would marry off for a certain amount of money, but also just that Mr. Darcy didn't think that they were socially good enough for Mr. Bingley, and that's the bottom line. So there are some accuracies when it comes to the book and the movie where they're talking about Darcy thinks that they're not socially strong enough to marry into a family like the Bingley family, but the way they portray it between the two movies is a little bit different. And that's what I wanted to talk about. Now, talking about a very iconic scene in the movie is when one of the youngest Bennet sisters runs off with Mr. Wickham. She is portrayed in the movie as a flirt, as someone who loves male attention, as someone who this kind of behaviour wouldn't be so surprising when it got announced at the end of the movie. Now, of course, people might watch the movie and think, okay, she got a boyfriend and she went off, what's the big deal? But Elizabeth's reaction, Mr. Darcy's reaction, the aunt and uncle's reaction is so accurate to what would have really happened, because the absolute sheer panic of an unsupervised lady that was not married going off on her own with a man in that time was simply unheard of and simply like so diabolically scandalous. Not only would they do exactly what they do in the movie, which is marry her off as soon as possible. But Mr. Wickham definitely would have used that to his advantage, because he would have known how socially the Bennet family would have looked if they didn't marry. So he could ask for things like money, property, he could ask for land, something like that, to have a kind of wager against them, because he knew they'd rather pay that than have society look at them in the way that they would. As sad as it is, women were the property of their fathers until they were the property of their husbands, even in this time, even though it wasn't as long ago. It was a couple hundred years ago, but it wasn't a crazy amount of time ago. It was only in the last kind of 100 years that stopped really being the case, and I would argue that in some cases, in some ways, it was still the case until very, very recently. But in this time especially, girls belonged to families. Girls belonged to their original family, then they married off to another family. Girls were not their own individual person, and they couldn't make individual decisions like she made in that movie. So when they found out she did that, maybe she got led astray, maybe, it was always Wickham's idea in their minds. Women didn't have kind of freedom of expression in the same way that they do today, and so they needed to marry her off, otherwise it would have been social suicide. They would have been seen as the family with loose women with loose morals, and that absolutely couldn't be done, because in that time your reputation was everything, your name was everything. You think gossip didn't exist back then? Just because there wasn't Facebook doesn't mean mums were not chit-chattering in town about how scandalous other people's daughters were. They absolutely were, and they absolutely wanted to avoid it, because it not only affected your social hierarchy ranking, but also you could have really gone down in the eyes of people you did business with, people you exchanged money with, people that worked your land. There were so many consequences to being looked down upon socially in that time, because that's all they had. They had money, they had, property, they had reputation, but that reputation was so fragile and could change at any time. And a lot of people made their careers, made their lives off their good reputation, and it was so important, especially when it came to girls, to keep a good reputation and be a good representation of your family, which is why Darcy's aunt in the movie talks about how shocking it was that all 5 of the sisters were out in society at that time. Now, if you don't know what out in society means, that's when they would attend balls, they would be looking for potential suitors. It just basically meant they were on the market. And she was so surprised by that, because it wasn't the known thing to do that. They should have had a nanny or someone to look after them, to teach them, to give them education, and then as they went on, one by one, they would go out into society, one would get married, the next one would go out, like that. So when she said, oh, there's all 5 of you out at once, that's because it's socially not acceptable to do that, and she couldn't believe it, and that kind of portrayed them as the lower class that they were trying to be portrayed as. And that's the context to that scene in the movie where she is surprised that Elizabeth is talking to her the way she did, because Elizabeth is a lady, and ladies at this time should be seen and not heard. And that is why Elizabeth's character is so important, because she embodies the kind of feminist movement that Jane Austen was trying to portray. Now, how accurate is Elizabeth Bennet's character as a whole? I would say not so accurate. I mean, it's the same way that Rose in the Titanic maybe wouldn't have been so boisterous. There are certain social things that would have subdued someone, and we can't say no one existed like that, because Jane Austen existed, Emily Bronte existed. These women that were their own bosses, their own muses, to express themselves in these different writings. And especially Jane Austen. Jane Austen features a lot of strong women in her writings. So I'm not saying there were none like this, because she had to get inspiration from somewhere, right? I mean, there's 2 possibilities. Either she based it on the women that were in her life, and there were definitely strong women in this era. There were definitely women with opinions that maybe didn't align to the social norms. But also maybe it was kind of a cry out for more women like this in society, and this is the kind of woman she wanted to be like. So it's a bit confusing, because I don't know if she's trying to portray real women that existed in this time or how she wanted women to be at this time, if that makes sense. But yeah, that was a lot of talking about social status and social class, but overall I do think they got it pretty accurate in terms of how they interact with each other, especially the upper class. But you have to remember, there is no perspective from the common people or the lower class, because they didn't fit into the story, they didn't fit into the interactions that these people would have. So you have to understand, when I'm talking about historically accurate, I'm talking about purely the historical accuracy of the upper class in Regency era England. Okay guys, that's the end of my video for Is Pride and Prejudice, the 2005 version, historically accurate? If you want to see more historically accurate videos, please let me know in the comments. Please suggest some movies you want me to deep dive if they're historically accurate or not. I've probably seen it if it's a movie about history, but if I haven't, I'd love to watch new movies. Please give me some recommendations. Okay, I'll see you in the next one.